Thank you all for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover today. We understand that functional safety, especially if you're new to the functional safety world, can be a complex and confusing thing. So we wanted to do an introduction to IEC 61508 lesson. And we're going to take a look at some examples and talk about especially mechanical devices such as a simple valve or actuator or solenoid. Quickly, there is a question tab on your panel. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them in the questions. At the end, I will try and answer any questions that anyone has. Anyone that has registered for this webinar, you'll receive a printout of the slides, PDF form, if you want to re-look at anything, and as well as a link to the recording of this webinar once it is made available. So today we are going to talk about IEC 61508, what's in the standard, who the standard was meant for, how to apply the concepts to simple mechanical devices, importance of data integrity, product certification process, key documentations, and the benefits of certification. My name is Loren Stewart. I work at Exida with the mechanical customers primarily. I also work on research. I've researched stiction and the mechanical failure rates comparisons, as well as created a database for the 2H initiative. We have locations worldwide, so no matter where you are or where your customers are, we have someone that's close by to you, so we can help you with any of your functional safety needs. For those of you that don't know Exida, we can be divided into different main product and service categories. So whether it's the process, the products, or the people, whatever you have dealing with functional safety, we have a division that can help you out. Whether it's consulting in alarm management, in cybersecurity, in process safety, machinery, whether you need some engineering tools to help you do calculations for FMEDAs, to set priorities to your alarms, or to take your data from your operations. To product certification, we have it in functional safety. We also have it in control systems, cybersecurity, and network robustness. We're going to talk a little bit about the functional safety, or the IEC 61508, on this webinar today. We also have training. We can come to you, you can come to us. We have training in control systems security, process safety, security development, alarm management. We have a lot of things that can be anywhere from a 1 to a 4 or a 5-day course, but we also have little things like these webinars that are posted on our website, or blogs that you can just read a paragraph or two on a particular subject that you're interested on. We also have reference materials. We have our textbooks and our databases. We have our white papers, market studies. So we have a lot of information to help you guide your way through anything functional safety, as well as our personnel certification. So if you want to become an expert in functional safety, we can help you get there. Just quickly, these are some of the books that we have published. And I like to say that we are an open book. So no matter if we're doing research, or how we do an FMEDA, or our database and failure rates, we publish all of the information we're doing. So we don't have any secrets. If you want to know anything about Exida, we either have blogs or webinars or white papers or textbooks on the subjects. So let's jump right into why you're here and what is IEC 61508. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for people that are just looking at mechanical devices such as a valve? And like I said, we have a lot to cover today, so let's just jump right in. We're going to start by talking about what IEC 61508 is, who cares, who should care about it, how it can be applied to simple mechanical devices, product certification, and so on. But to start understanding what functional safety is and who should care about it, functional safety defined by IEC 61508 is a main goal in mind. It's the goal for the automatic safety function and will perform the intended function correctly, or that the system will fail in a predictable or a safe manner. So when a lot of people hear safety, they think of what has been drilled into everybody's head in manufacturing. No accidents. So they think of, well, should I be able to lift this on my own or do I need assistance? They think of, I need to be careful on this ladder. They're not thinking of functional safety as a whole. When we are talking about functional safety of a valve, if it's a close-on-trip application, we want that valve to close when it is called into need. When everything else has gone wrong, they need to shut the process down and do it quickly. That valve needs to be able to do that or have the system fail in a safe manner. So who came up with IEC 61508? Some people think that a functional safety company like Exida came up with this standard. Well, that's not the case. A bunch of different organizations worldwide came together and formed a committee. We had participants from Germany that worked on the DIN standards. The United States has the ISA standard. There's many, many different standards in many, many different countries. And they all participated to talk about functional safety, who should care, and what it needs to say. So IEC 61508, or IEC, is an international standard. It's not just something that's recognized in one country or another. It's something that IEC is recognized worldwide. So you will know if you see a SIL capability rating of a SIL 2 or SIL 3 from IEC, it doesn't matter if that's in the United States or if it is in Germany or if it's in Italy. All of those places will be evaluated to the same group of standards and same requirements. IEC 61508. Generally, it says it is applied to the automatic protection systems. It measures, it is a measure of protection against random hardware fault tolerance, and we'll find out what that means, along with systematic design failures, and we'll talk about what both random and systematic failures are. It can be applied to both product and project level work. So it can just be the turnkey systems or it can be off-the-shelf applications. It doesn't matter. IEC 61508 can be applied to both cases. This IEC 61508 standard is targeted to suppliers. It's manufacturers. That is a basic safety standard upon which other functional safety standards get developed. So anyone making a safety-related system or a safety-related products for use of others really needs to follow this standard. It's broken up into different sections. There's 4 main parts and then 3 guideline sections of the standard. It defines what functional safety is, it defines what SIL or safety integrity level is, and it defines the safety life cycle, which is very important. It says in the standard that certification is optional, but the assessment against the requirements throughout the IEC 61508 is not. So you're going to need to go through each requirement to make sure that you're qualifying from all of the requirements, but a third-party certification is not 100% necessary. What getting a third-party certification is it's showing your customers that you have done a lot of work and this really means something. It's one thing that you say, like, we're really, really good, we're the best, but it's another thing when somebody else is calling you the best or when somebody else says how great you are. So a lot of end users are saying, well, we don't want your house certificate. We don't want your own assessment of yourself. We want somebody that's not involved with you to come in and evaluate you to make sure you are doing all of those things that you think you are. IEC 61508, it started as a non-governmental industry standard, and it has been growing and growing and growing. And with it being adopted in more and more countries and just being known in the engineering field, it's starting to get actually enforced. Currently, its level of use and its application is so prevalent in the world that it can be very harmful for an organization to ignore the standards recommendations. As most societies continue to advance and become more risk averse, compliance with IEC 61508 is becoming all but practically mandatory in most parts of the industrialized world. And even in some countries, the standard has been accepted by governments and forced into law. Most countries, it has not been to that level yet, but it is considered as standard engineering practices or best practices. And when accidents happen, the standard can be cited in civil cases as a commonly accepted standard in the world for performance. And also insurance companies are starting to push back on end users saying that they're not going to certify their plant until it is certified by a third party from IEC 61508. We get a lot of questions, especially myself in the mechanical field, asking, well, it says in the standards it's written for an EEPE-based system. EEPE standing for electrical, electronic, programmable electronic. So where does mechanical come into play? We don't have to follow this, correct? Well, that's a common misconception on people that are just getting into functional safety. So the first thing I tell all of the people that ask me that is just Google it. That's what I do when I don't know something. So as you can see, this is a screenshot. I just typed into Google IEC 61508 and mechanical elements. And the first link that comes up is for the IEC website itself. And it brings you to an FAQ page. And as you can see, number 4 answers the question, but I can't see that far and I can't read that, so we're going to blow it up. So as you can see, it answers the direct question about, well, I'm just a valve. I don't have any electronics or programmable electronics on my valve, so I don't have to follow it. And the standard specifically says, while you don't have to meet every single requirement in the standard, you obviously aren't going to have software, so you don't have to worry about coding, but you still need to check off the boxes for a low complexity project, and they have low complexity requirements. And with you checking off all of those requirements, even though you didn't meet every single requirement of the standard, you're still going to be qualified. because they understand that simple mechanical devices aren't going to meet everything. The standard is broken up into a couple main pieces, but they all fall under IEC 61508. It's commonly noted as the umbrella standard. It applies to all suppliers in it's a performance-based standard, and it applies to all suppliers. If you want information in different, more specialized fields, you can look at, say, the nuclear sector, or IEC 62061 machinery, or the process industry sector. So that would be your end users would use IEC 61511. But the standard that started it all was IEC 61508. So now that we know a little bit about the standard, if you've ever talked to someone that's talking about functional safety or the standard, the first thing they say is SIL. Well, SIL stands for Safety Integrity Level. So let's look into what SIL is and who really cares. IEC 61511 defines SIL as a discrete level, 1 to 4, for specifying the safety integrity requirements of the safety instrumented functions to be allocated to the safety instrumented systems. SIL 4 has the highest safety, and SIL 1 would be considered the lowest. But if you go, so the overall concept of a SIL, it's to quantify how well the SIF performs its job of managing risks. It gives you a level. But if you look further into IEC 61511, you'll see that it only defines the requirements for SIL 1 through SIL 3. Because it's just expected that SIL 3 will be the maximum level in the process sector. And of course, this excludes nuclear, so you can look into the nuclear section to get more information on that. But IEC 61511 just has 1 through 3 level requirements listed. If it says you do need to figure out what SIL 4 requirements, it tells you to go back to IEC 61508. And I can honestly say I have never seen a process that needs a SIL 4. Never seen a product that has received a SIL 4, and I've been here for a few years. I don't know anybody else that has either. So SIL 4 we consider kind of that mythical creature like a unicorn that people say it exists, but no one's ever really seen it. So why do we care about safety integrity levels? Well, you can find your safety integrity level by doing 3 things. You look at the systematic capability, you look at the architectural constraints for the element, and the PFD calculations. So this is a pretty beautiful blue, yellow, gray chart that just drives the point home. I'm a visual person. I need to see visually what we're talking about. If you do great at 1 or at 2 of these categories, it doesn't really matter in the eyes of SIL. You need to be in that beautiful sweet spot in the middle. That means that you have achieved complete compliance. So if you have great PFD average numbers or probability of failure, but you're not considering the other 2, it doesn't matter what you do. So let's break apart each one of these categories to see more in depth what we mean by SIL capability or probability of failure or architectural constraints. So systematic capability we'll begin with. And what systematic capability is is it's is established by having your quality management system audited per IEC 61508. So it looks at your procedures and at your documents. So if this quality system meets the requirements that IEC 61508 says that all of them need to be achieved, you're given a SIL capability rating. And that SIL capability rating is issued directly onto the certificate if you get your product certified. And for a SIL 3, you're going to have a bunch of different requirements that the standard says. And if you go to SIL 2, you'll have a lot, but less than SIL 3, and SIL 1 will have the least amount of requirements that you need to meet to show your systematic capability. So, in the end of being evaluated in the audit, if you go through the whole certification process, the certificate is your final product and it will list your systematic capability on it. Next, we're going to look at architectural constraints. Architectural constraints are what more commonly known as redundancy. So the end user would look at architectural constraints to determine if they need to put redundant systems in or not. To figure out your architectural constraints of a product for IEC 61508, you can either follow Route 1H or Route 2H. Route 1H involves a safe failure fraction for the element, or Route 2H is proven in use history. Because normally a product is certified, like a valve is typically one component of the final element of a safety instrumented function. So it's just one piece of that final element. You cannot do, well, you can, but it's not going to go well for you if you figure out a safe failure fraction of just your valve. So in the middle of the screen there is the equation for safe failure fraction. It's the ratio of safe failures over the safe and the dangerous failures together. So it's showing what percentage of those failures are going to be safe compared to the total failures. Well, that's great for something that has internal diagnostics or programmable electronics. But if you have something simply mechanical, if you're just looking at the valve by itself, it can't figure out if it needs to close on its own. It needs to be told to do something. So the standard has a second way of evaluating products, especially simple mechanical devices, and it's called Route 2H. It was introduced in the 2010 version of the standard. And it is the assessment of the reliability data for the entire element. So looking at 2H data, you can, as long as you don't have something new and innovative to the field that you've never seen before, it's something that you can say that this type of O-ring or this bolt, it's been in the market, it's been proven by hundreds and thousands and millions of hours, billions of hours, and we know that this is going to work. We know how it's going to work, so we can design through it. So the final portion of that diagram is the PFDavg calculation. And the PFDavg calculation is probability of failure on demand. And it is based on the dangerous failure rate, the system diagnostics, the proof test coverage, the test intervals, the mission time, all of that good stuff. And typically, the final element assemblies will have a PFDavg that will only meet SIL 1, just because they take up such a large chunk of the allowable PFD for the entire system. However, there's things that can be done, such as diagnostics or proof tests or lowering the mission time that can improve your PFD average. I thought I had the calculation there. That comes up later, so we'll talk about that more in a minute. Well, now that you know how a SIL is found, now what do you do with it? Who cares? Well, the safety integrity level can be used in 4 ways. So your customers can use it 4 different ways when you give them these numbers. So the first way is to establish risk reduction requirements. They could use the SIL level to look at the probabilistic for random hardware failures, the architectural constraints that we talked about a little bit earlier, and to establish systematic capability. So once again, we'll go ahead through each one of these points and talk about it. So the first way is to look at and establish risk reduction factor. And I learn best with examples. So here's a quick, easy, simplistic example for us to look at. So your customers and end users, they do a PHA, or process hazard analysis. And they determine that a specific hazard can occur once every 10 years. Well, that could be okay, but this hazard actually causes a major release of toxic fumes into the atmosphere. And I'm pretty sure toxic fumes in the atmosphere isn't the best idea to do every 10 years. So, whether it's the owner of the plant or upper management determines that they can only have that occur really once every 500 years. That's the acceptable risk that they're ready to tolerate in the company and in the world, because chances are the plant's not going to be up for 500 years. In doing so, they need to know how to take the risk from 500 years down, or from 10 years up to 500. So you want it to be 500 divided by the 10, so your risk reduction factor would be 50. So what do you do with that? Well, in the standard, there's these SIL tables, and there's some for many different things, but this is the one for risk reduction factor. So you can go to this chart and see what SIL level your SIF, or safety function, needs to have to achieve the risk reduction you need to get that 10 years to 500 years. So in looking at this, you see, well, SIL 1 is from 10 to 100. Great. We just need a SIL 1 SIF. Well, maybe. Because 50 is right in the middle of that, there's a 50% chance that you're not going to meet your risk requirements or risk reduction requirements. So you can either say, I need a SIL 1 with at least a risk reduction factor of 50, or I need a SIL 2. So each SIL level is an order of magnitude different in risk reduction required. The next way is to set probabilistic limits for hardware random failures. And that is through looking at PFD, or probability of failure on demand. And once again, it's a order of magnitude. You can see if you have a SIL 1, it can have a probability of failure of these numbers, or you can go backwards and say, I need a probability of these numbers, so I'll need this SIL level. And here's the PFD. If you just look at the probability of failure on demand, it's this long, really fun equation that includes integrals and lots of good stuff that chances are you haven't done on your own since college. But if we take the PFD average of, or the average of the PFD calculation, it's a much simplified version of the equation. So you look at your proof test coverage, your dangerous undetected failures. So those dangerous undetected failures, you as a product manufacturer would give to your customers in doing a FMEDA. We'll talk about that in product certification section. But your customers can enter the proof test interval and the mission time, all of that stuff to get their PFDavg calculated number. So once again, on this chart, you can see what goes into each of these 3 categories and why it is important now to look at all 3 of these. So why does this matter? Who does this really pertain to? Well, it matters because of a lot of things, and we'll talk about some legal reasons that you need to care. But one of the things you need to think about is data integrity. Whether you want the data to be good data giving to your customers, or if you're an end user, you want to use good numbers in your calculations. So we're going to talk about what is the real impact of too good to be true data. Well, there can be multiple effects of using bad data, especially if you're using them in calculations. So we like to say that this is the bridge of safety. You can be doing everything right, but if you don't necessarily do the calculations correct because you're using this overly optimistic data, there are certain portions of the bridge that will just fall down. And would you want to drive your car over a bridge that loses certain supports? Because even though you think you're doing everything correctly, using optimistic data can just be fooling yourself. So the use of optimistic data could lead to insufficient redundancy or insufficient testing. It could be the risk reduction that your customers need to reach is not actually reached. So those could be. So the dictionary defines bad as failing to reach an acceptable standard, or poor, such as a bad repair job. Well, exida defines bad data as the data that leads to an unrealistic and often dangerous designs. And of course, risk will vary with the use and where it's used and why you're saying something. So say it's somebody in marketing and they use overly optimistic data. In a brochure, it could say, look, we have a very, very high quality stuff. It has never failed. It never will. We're awesome. Well, your risk is pretty low. You might have a bruised reputation. You might just be looked at, well, they exaggerate. Don't take their word for it. But it's not too much of a big deal. But if that use is in safety reliability calculations and you say, look, the math shows that you don't need redundancy, you never need to test the function, you're great. You just need one of these, plug in, forget about it. Well, that risk can be very high. There's a potential loss of life due to under-designed systems or under-test systems, and I wouldn't want that on my conscience. So what are some companies missing? Well, one of the premises of IEC 61508 and 511 is that the automated protection system with diagnostics and periodic testing can provide higher safety reliability than typical control functions. But to say that you have that higher reliability, the standard says you need to take all of these steps, and you must place claim and show exactly why and how you have that higher safety reliability. But those steps are only valid or appropriate if good data is used. If bad data is used, you can do the calculations correctly. You can do everything you want to do. Go through all the steps, and it will be a waste of time and mean nothing. So how do you get that data? What are failure rates and how do you get those? Well, there's a couple different ways of getting failure rate. You can look at industry databases, manufacturers' FMEDAs or field failure studies, and detailed field failure study reports. So there's plus and minuses on every single portion of these, which there are with everything in life, I believe. So you have your industry database. That can be a lot of information, that can be really great, but it's not application specific and it's not product specific. You can have your manufacturer's FMEDA or the field failure study and look through that, where it could be, it definitely is product specific. It could be application specific or not. You'd have to take a deeper look into that. And you have a detailed field failure study with an application model. So that would be product and application specific. So the first way looking at that is mechanical cycle testing. So cycle testing is great for high demand or constant continuous demand applications. It's useful for estimating failure rates when the dominant mechanical failure rates are due to premature or wear out of components. So this occurs in applications with frequent dynamic motion. There's a lot of lubrication and mechanical loading. When you do cycle test, and for it to be counted, testing must be done till at least 10% of the population have failed. Then the cycle test number is scaled, which if you're using machine safety or something that has demands once a day, that's a great way of figuring out your failure rate. However, hopefully, if you're using a valve in a safety system, hopefully your demand is not once a day, that this is the last course of action and is shutting down. So because of other elements in static applications such as stiction and cold welding, corrosion, binding, all of these things come into play more often when the valve or the actuator does not move often. So these things grow to a level and then plateau. So you could be grossly underestimating or giving grossly optimistic failure rates if you're not taking into consideration these applications. Another way is field failure studies. And if you have sufficient information, you represent a rich opportunity to get failure rates for a specific mode of information about a product in a specific application. However, most of the time, there isn't enough information to create that database that you need to do proper failure rates for. However, even if you have some of the information, that's very useful. You can't necessarily get the failure rates from it, but there's a lot that you can do with that information. But one of the problems with field failure studies is sometimes manufacturers' warranty departments say, well, this isn't a failure, it doesn't count. Well, sometimes it could be counted as a dangerous failure. And even if you have a company with multiple locations, one location from one location could say, one team could say, well, this is a failure. The next team could say, no, that should not have been counted. And that's within the same company, let alone from company to company. So if you get failure rates from these type of applications and you try and compare them, it's certainly not going to be an apples to apples type of comparison. Another way to get failure rates is FMEDA, or Failure Modes Effect and Diagnostic Analysis. And this is a predictive failure rate analysis. What we do here when we do our FMEDAs, we consider the drawing and the bill of material and the environment and the type of application that this device is going in. So we can look at subsea valve close-on trip application. We go through each line of the bill of material per O-ring, per gasket, per nuts and bolts, and we figure out how we can possibly break it. If this binds, or if it breaks, or if it leaks, how will that affect the function? Can the valve still close if it needs to close? From that FMEDA, we are able to calculate the entire product failure rate, along with the product failure modes and the diagnostic coverage. And when we're done with the FMEDA, we always compare it to a proven and use study if we can. So that's looking at the failure rates that come from shipping and field failure return numbers. Obviously, we want the FMEDA to be a little conservative. If you're planning on this many failures or this much of a failure rate, you certainly don't want to give an overly optimistic failure rate once again. So all of our FMEDAs are validated results. Whether you are a person certifying your product or if you're an end user receiving this certificate, always make sure that you do the sanity check. First of all, make sure it's the correct application. If you look at the assumed demands per year, make sure that those demands are what you actually need. If you are in a low demand type of application, you don't want something that's assumed demands per year are 10. I don't think your plant is shutting down about once a month with an emergency. So always make sure that that makes sense along with the failure rates, and we'll talk about that right now. So this is a snapshot of our Excellentia tool, and we basically set up a design. We have a sensor, a logic solver, and a final element group. We have our final element group having a valve, an actuator, and a solenoid. And we did the calculations. So what can this become? Well, the first thing to note, we purposely entered overly optimistic data that we actually saw in the real world, which was a little scary. But if you can see in blue in the pie chart, the final elements, all of that, is only 5% of the total, which we know from experience it takes up the majority of the PFDavg contributions. Then we look at the PFDavg, and we see that this achieves a SIL2 with no diagnostics or no redundancy. Well, that's awesome. Great, I can set this whole SIF in, I never ever have to test it, and there only needs to be one, and I'm good to go. I can plug it in and completely forget about it. But if you go down to the bottom, we find out that this whole SIF has a failure rate of 12.1 failures in time, or FITs. You're thinking, great, this must be a really well-designed system. Well, so including sensors, logic solvers, valves, actuators, solenoids, everything, you can plug this in, never test it, and it work for 9,458 years. Okay, now you know something's a little fuzzy is going on. That's not how I found sensors and logic solvers and valves work. But maybe you found an exception to the rule, right? But if that's the case, we should probably make everything in the world like that so we can use everything for almost 9,500 years. So we did the exact same configuration, all of the same parts, but this time we put more realistic data in. As you can see, the blue part is now the main contributing factor, which is, it makes sense. Now we look at the risk reduction factor. It's only 37, but you can change that by testing more often, or doing a complete test, or maybe adding a leak test to your proof testing, or shortening the mission time. There's many things that you can do to change your PFDavg number and your risk reduction factor. You can simply implement diagnostics. That's a huge way to really help yourself out. So for the whole CIF, it's 1311 fits, so 1,311. Well, that sounds more realistic, but if you don't know fits, and that's hard to visualize, this system can be in play for 87 years. That sounds a lot. So why does it really matter using this good data or whatnot? Well, say you have a reactor. Say this is your sys, including you have your BPCS, power supplies, CPUs, all of that goodness. Well, using unsafe data, you're just introducing a ticking time bomb to your system. If you only need a single or no redundancy, that's great. But if you need redundancy, you'd much rather, it'd be much cheaper to figure this out in the beginning than to find it out after an accident. And not only will it be cheaper, there's now in this sue crazy, sue happy world, there's legal ramifications to everything that you do. Whether it's the design engineer, people will go back and say, well, did they actually demonstrate a reasonable level of expertise and judgment? Huh. Well, the EPC, did they provide adequate training and controls, or the OEM? Did they supply applications appropriate this information? And the asset owners, well, did they implement and maintain an acceptable PSM program? So all of these, nowadays, you realize things can actually come back and hurt you personally, not just your company. And the courts have actually started to decide this, whether it's an accident that people get killed. Well, people have been indicated on manslaughter counts, not just a company held responsible, but actual people. And companies, they can be held liable themselves. Bad designs have its own consequences. The jury actually found them liable. So it's not just something that you just want to feel good about. It's something that you have to do in this day and age. So how do you do that? Well, if you're an end user, you make sure you use certified products. If you are a manufacturer, you get your product certified so you can help your customer out. You can sell a lot more that way. So in the certification of a device, we always start with a kickoff meeting. We perform an FMEDA, and in parallel, we do the proven in use analysis so they can counter check each other. They make sure that there isn't something missing on either end. Then we look and do a process analysis and an on-site audit. Once all of those issues have been cleaned up, every single requirement of the IEC standard is met, then you are received an assessment report and your certification. So when you are making a product, you can start in the very beginning implementing IEC 61508, and in doing so, you'll take down a lot of work that you would do playing catch up later on. So if you implement the safety life cycle in the beginning, it can really help you through getting certified. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but it can be broken down into two main concepts. The design reliability, being the systematic faults or design mistakes, and hardware reliability, or the random failures. The random failures, you get your random failure rate from your or from your FMEDA, and your systematic faults you cover from your systematic capability or your quality processes and documents. So if you do implement early on in the safety life cycle functional safety, it really helps your product development because it helps you document the safety life cycle. It helps you look for safety related functions, validation plan. It helps you define your architecture. There's some other things that are for type B or smart devices that we're not going to talk about today because we're mechanical. And this is just a snapshot of all of the different documents we're going to look for through certification. So if you're an end user and you're given a certificate from when you purchase your valve, just see how much the product you're buying from went through to get this information for you. It's a very great and tough thing to accomplish, so brag about it if you actually have gone through this process. To evaluate it, we do our safety case database. So we take every argument in the standard and we go by document, line by line to say, well, this requirement is met in this document in this line item. And we make sure that all of the requirements of the entire standard are met before a certificate goes out. And then when it's wrapped up, you will be presented a certificate. So all of your hard work is given to you. And as you can see on this example, in the middle of the page, you have systematic capability, SIL blank. On the back, you're going to have the failure rates that cover your random capability, along with that this one is 2H. So this shows you exactly all of those things we just talked about. So if you have any questions later on, please email me. I know we kind of ran up to the very limit of time. So like I said, we had a lot to cover and talk about. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have questions, please send me an email. Thank you.